welcome to Beating a Dead Horse, where we tell you who lived, who died, and who deserved to die. I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, in honor of the passing of the late, great George Romero, we watched Night of the Living Dead. Night of the Living Dead is the granddaddy of all zombie movies, and everything you have seen and will see in a zombie movie is straight from this movie. It is basically, if you can think of a zombie movie, and think of like 5 of them, and then mush them together, and you have Night of the Living Dead, which both speaks to the prowess of this movie and how ahead of its time it was, as well as how unchanging zombie movies have been.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. So Sean, what did you think of seeing this movie for the first time?
Yeah, this is my first time watching it, which is kind of surprising, just given that I'm a big zombie movie fan. I went through that whole phase that everyone did in middle school where we all love zombies and we all read about them and yada yada. So for me, I was really excited to watch this, and this is going to be tricky, so stay with me on this, because I'm going to open up the sentence with, I was a bit disappointed. I don't think it's the movie's fault that I wasn't blown away by it. I immensely respect what this movie is, what it did, what it has become. I think it is a masterpiece unto itself. The problem is that having seen umpteenth zombie movies before, this is kind of like, there wasn't anything that unexpected that I hadn't seen before, which was a bummer to me, because I was expecting this to just be mind-blowing and life-changing. So when it wasn't, it was a bit of a letdown for me. So I guess part of the problem is I had too high of expectations. I've seen too many zombie movies, which is to say I've seen any zombie movie, given they're all just copies of this very, very good movie. So it was kind of a bummer in general. It wasn't a bad movie. It just, too many things lined up against it in my book.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair to say. I guess full disclosure on my behalf, I had never seen any of the Dead movies, any of George Romero's zombie movies. I think this is the first George Romero movie I've seen in general. I remember one time when I was in high school, I put on this movie. It was on Netflix or something, and I was sort of interested because, again, high school, middle school, that's when the zombie thing is most appealing, I feel like. So I tried to watch it, and the beginning of this movie is kind of weird, and I think that's interesting now, watching it when I'm a bit older. But back then, I was just sort of bored and put off by the beginning. And I was like, I don't, and I'm not gonna watch this old movie. I don't have the time.
I am happy. Yeah, speaking to that though, I am happy that I waited to watch this movie, because the opening is very slow and very 70s B movie. So it's nice to have a perspective where you can appreciate a slow pacing rather than just be like, come on, let's get to the brains and yeah, Nickelback.
Yeah, and I think watching it, because I kind of agree and don't. Watching this movie was a bit of a ride, because I was shocked and impressed and kind of mad, but not at the movie, except for maybe impressed, because I was impressed that you're completely correct. This is the movie that originated every zombie trope, and when I say every zombie trope, I mean every single one.
All of them. All of them.
Survivors, trapped in the house, the bites turning into zombies, the, someone among them is bit and that information comes out and they're unwilling to let them go. A character we previously seen comes back as a zombie to traumatize another character who they cared about.
Even the ending, which I'm not going to get into spoilers, but you've seen it.
Well, the ending is actually interesting, because that is sort of the one point, not that it's super different, but it's also a pretty famous ending. I knew how this movie ended. That's pretty much the only thing I knew about this movie, other than like, the fact that it started all these tropes.
No, I'm not knocking it. Don't get me wrong on this.
Sure.
It's not me saying it's a bad ending by any means. It's everything about this movie is genre defining, and that's what makes this movie and why it is so highly respected and regarded. It's just a movie. It's a move you've seen before. You know what's happening. I knew it was going to happen before it even got there.
Yeah, and that's sort of what made me, like I said, kind of impressed, kind of shocked, and kind of mad. Shocked and impressed that George Romero took this idea and it arrived fully formed. I think we tend to think of this movie as being older than it actually is. I don't know if that's because it's in black and white. But 1968, that's pretty recent. That's not that old in the grand scheme of things. It's only like a decade before Alien. And a lot of that, has to do with its budget that gives it kind of that older feeling.
But they did a lot with that budget to make it still very impressive.
They did a lot, yeah.
Costumes still worked really well. They took some creative liberties with some of the shots to make them look worse and more gory than they were. They minimized what you could actually see to, only have to make up half of a skull as opposed to a full skull to give it to, your imagination is worse than anything they could show you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the directing on display is pretty impressive, and but also impressive was just like, again, how fully formed it was and how modern it feels in a lot of ways. Just in terms of some of the writing. I mean, some of the writing feels pretty old. Some of the performances definitely feel very 60s. But some of the decisions made, and these are kind of getting into like the death tropes, like spoilers, so maybe have to wait a little bit to go into more specifics, but some of the decisions made are not something I would expect from a movie made in the 60s. And again, a lot of that just has to do with kind of that punk rock, like indie, like horror vibe that the movie just has.
Really sticking it to the man, sticking it to stereotypes, kind of showing what, minorities and the oppressed can do. It is a very punk rock. Like, punk rock is a great way of describing it. Like, that is what it is. It's in the beginning of the eras of punk rock and that whole movement in general. Punk rock is the perfect descriptor of a lot of this movie. I'm not going to lie. I hadn't looked at it that way, and you nailed it just so hard.
Yeah, so that's sort of the stuff I think that still remains interesting to think about this movie, and why I think this movie still has merit in being watched as opposed to being like just the granddaddy of zombie movies. I think there's still some stuff in there that really stands out as being worthy of consideration on its own terms. But to kind of get to the other side of the coin, I was mad not at the movie, but and I say this, I'm gonna preface this as my first project as a creative writer was a zombie book, so I fully include myself in this. But I was just so mad at every like hack zombie movie, and even the zombie movies that are considered like good, that are considered like quality productions. Just, I felt like after watching this movie, I was not upset at zombies as a thing. Like, I know that they're kind of played out by this point, and it kind of comes and goes, like, how much people are into zombies, but, like, I didn't really have strong feelings about them after that initial, like, kind of being really into them. But now, this movie, I feel like the zombie movie is, like, the most creatively bankrupt thing you can possibly make.
There are very few zombie-based creative properties that stand out to me upon watching this movie as interesting and different. They all, as Jackson was saying, they kind of become one another. They are all based on this, and they all take tropes from this, and they all funnel back to Night of the Living Dead. legitimately the one thing that will always stand out to me as such a wonderful job with the zombie genre. And I have to gush about this. I'm not even going to lie to you that half of this is just me saying, go read. Do not watch. Read World War Z. The book is one of the greatest books I have ever read. The movie is absolute garbage trash. Don't watch it. But the book takes such an interesting take on zombies as a whole. Just they look at it from a totally different direction, a journalistic approach from an already happened apocalypse. We lived, we won. Here's what's happening now, and it's heart-wrenching, it's moving, it's well written, it's a beautiful piece. And that was Sean's book minute. Go read it.
The thing about that book is that it has a particular style, like kind of like a mission statement that they're going to treat the zombie apocalypse as something that actually happened. So not just in terms of like the plot, like think about like the logistics of how the military would do this or that or cover it up, or how people would react. Well, not just on the character level, but on the prose level, the structure level, by treating it as kind of this in-universe, like, historical
Fact.
journalistic piece. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that makes that book stand out a lot more. And I would definitely agree with that assessment, that it's definitely one of the best zombie stories that I've read. I'm sort of hesitant because I've also of the mind that zombie games, and this is a little bit off topic, and maybe we should save it for another day, but I think zombie games are a bit of a different matter just because of how that medium works mechanically. I think zombies are a bit of a more interesting enemy to fight than your average like soldier like shooting at you, because they make you think about like space and like crowd control, and then often they're like special zombies. It's sort of the mix of the situation, whereas in a first-person shooter, when you're shooting at other people who can shoot back, you're just kind of stuck behind a wall a lot of the time. And so I think zombie games are a bit of a different matter, but either way, even with those games, though, the tropes come out in, like, full force. And, I mean, it's even worse in games because they just tend to have worse writing in general. But I'm trying to think of another zombie movie that left a really strong impression on me in any way.
The only one that's really coming to me, and basically as a forewarning for our listeners, this is going to be a lot of looking at zombie movies through the eyes of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead and how they created the zombie and how this undead has influenced our lives. It's a podcast about the undead, not just the dead. So we're definitely going to be taking a look at the influence that this has had and what makes certain areas of it stand out and what kind of falls behind. We are, of course, still going to take a deep look at George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, but just kind of a forewarning on that end.
Yeah, maybe more retrospective element than strict like scene like film analysis than usual.
Yeah,
but
we
there are definitely still things I want to cover about this movie. So if that's sort of what you're here for, rest assured we will be talking about it.
Before we do, though, I was going to say the one movie that does stand out to me as kind of a good zombie movie, and part of this could be I was really traumatized by it as a child.
Oh no, what movie?
Was Shaun of the Dead.
Oh, okay. So I have not seen Shaun of the Dead. I guess before I make that declaration about zombie movies, I should put that one up in as kind of a disclaimer because I know that one's pretty beloved. So I have not seen Shaun of the Dead. But
obviously we haven't seen all these movies by any means, so we're just going to be going off of the ones that we have and our own experiences. But Shaun of the Dead was a very funny movie. It was very enjoyable, and it took kind of along the same lines as Zombieland, which undermines my point a little bit in that there's two funny zombie movies. But to even make a funny zombie movie is one thing. Zombieland and Shaun of the Dead are, in a way, two different beasts as well. Because Shaun of the Dead still has a lot of horror focus to it. It creates brevity from the horror, and that's what really makes it work unto itself. It's kind of an interesting piece. As I said, it did traumatize me as a kid because there is a scene when one of the characters gets offed in a very grisly manner, and it was probably one of the first R-rated movies I saw. And it really upset me as a child. So part of the reason Shaun of the Dead might stick out so well is because I was a little scarred from that one. It also shares my name, which my parents had no shame in bringing up a lot when it came out. So there might be some reasons why I remember that more than another one.
Shaun of the Dead was also a film directed by famed director of Scott Pilgrim and Baby Driver, Edgar Wright. So I don't doubt for a second that it's better than your average, like, run-of-the-mill zombie movie. Like, even Zombieland, the difference, I can't speak for the comparison to Shaun of the Dead, but so much of Zombieland is just relying on you knowing these tropes and just kind of acknowledging that they exist. And then, oh, look, isn't it funny that Jesse Eisenberg knows to do this thing because he's got all these zombie rules?
That is a good point, though. It leans heavily on the tropes created by Night of the Living Dead. So even though it is a comedy zombie movie, which there aren't a whole lot of, it's still a Night of the Living Dead zombie movie. It is what it is. It's just that again. Just tongue-in-cheek, self-aware, haha, look at us, we know what we're doing.
And then proceeding to do all the tropes anyway.
Yeah.
At least to my memory, again, like I haven't thought about Zombieland like at all until we started talking about Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, no, I totally forgot that movie came out.
So I guess just in terms of other movies, I think the biggest offender, not a movie but a show, the thing I was most mad at upon watching Night of the Living Dead was the Walking Dead TV show. I must stress, not the comics, not the Telltale game, but the show.
What about that cover-based shooter Walking Dead game? How do you feel about that one?
Daryl Merrill shooting zombies. Yeah, so we'll rope that one into it too. Why not? But no, so the show, I was incredibly angry at, because one of the things I appreciate about Night of the Living Dead is not just that it arrived fully formed, but that it's pretty economical in terms of, like, its structure and screenplay. Like, there isn't a lot of fat. Its points are made very efficiently, which makes it, aside from kind of the weird beginning, like, after you hit a certain point, arguably the less interesting part of the movie, just because it kind of plays out how you'd expect, but, like, as a standalone work, the points are made fast and they're made well with, like, character beats and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things that drove me nuts about The Walking Dead, the show, was just how it takes all of this same stuff. Like, it doesn't do a damn thing unique to something that, like, Romero hadn't already done. And I gave up on the show at about, like, halfway through season 2 because of just how it was going nowhere. But it takes all this stuff, the, drama over who's been bit, oh, man is the real monster, like, who can you trust, and, like, the infighting, and just stretches it out. I mean, it's on, like, season 8, I think, now?
I have no idea. I've never watched it, I have to say that. I read the first couple anthologies of it, and part of it might have been that this was before the show even came out, so I was still pretty young at that point, and I remember really liking it. And part of that could just be how it translates from comic to TV show, where comics tend to not have that hook that keeps tying you in, I feel, as much.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it's a totally different medium. There's a hook at the end of each story to bring you to the next chapter of the story. But from comic to comic, like, usually there's like 5 comics in a chapter, so to speak. You don't have hooks from one issue to the next as much because it's part of a complete series, so it doesn't have that need to. I feel like the show, from what I heard, tends to rely on those hooks more frequently, and it's the same consistent trope. So I can't speak to whether the Walking Dead comic is actually better or not, just because I haven't seen the show, but I like to think it is.
I mean, from what I've seen, the comic is just better regarded in general for a lot of reasons. And, I've never read the comic. I have played the Telltale game, which I actually do enjoy quite a bit, but that kind of introduces some other things because it's kind of treating zombies in a mechanical way that it hadn't really been done in games before. But, it also just... The game just also has, strong characters. And that's sort of the thing about the zombie movie as a form, in that more than any other, I don't know about more than any other type of story, but it very much has to live or die by its characters because it keeps using the same structure. Zombie movies really only end one of two ways. They either get to a safe haven or they die. And that's pretty much true of every single zombie movie. Or more often than not, they'll get to a safe haven and then it's bad and then they die.
What a twist.
What a twist indeed. So because of that, it really lives or dies on how much you enjoy the characters and how they're going to interact. But the problem with that is that the form limits the characters and what types they can be so much that you just end up seeing the same sorts of people, the level-headed hero, the sweet kid, the asshole who ruins the group, the coward, the crazy dictator guy the governor in The Walking Dead. It just keeps going back to these types that Romero treaded over very well in Night of the Living Dead, and I'm assuming any other trope that maybe exists that we don't see in Night of the Living Dead is created by Dawn or Day of the Dead, later.
That might be why Shaun of the Dead works so well, because it does stand out to me. I actually remember more about it than I think I do, because going back on it, there's not really a standout hero or anything like that. They're all a bunch of bumbling assholes, and that's kind of the point, is it's just kind of a bunch of assholes who are positive that the only place that they can go to be safe is a pub. And it's a joke, the whole thing. And, of course, the pub is not as safe as they like it to be, but it's played in such a way where it doesn't... I don't know. The characters in it are just not your usual characters, as opposed to being your set team of 6 or 8, and each of them have their defined characteristics. They're all just kind of not sure what they're doing, and just hoping and praying for the best, and we laugh along with them, which you don't see as much, because in the standard zombie media, so to speak, you see much more of a regimented characters, as you were saying, which lends themselves to repeated scenarios and acting like they have a plan, and we're gonna get this car, and we're gonna go here, and we're gonna do that. In this, it's just, we're gonna get to the pub, we're gonna have a drink, I don't know how we're gonna do that. Let's go.
Bam! Here we go. Yeah, and I think that's sort of what makes the Telltale Walking Dead game interesting to me, is that I think later, I haven't played Season 3. I only just realized there was a Season 3 a few days ago, which is a shame because I used to really enjoy that series. But I think especially in that first season, the characters don't fit into the types quite that neatly. They feel quite like individuals. And the other thing that really helps is even if they do indulge in the tropes every once in a while, again, just the fact that they're taking, just like World War Z, it's kind of taking a new formal approach, like the choose your own adventure, Heavy Rain,
Heavy Rain is the example you went with for choose your own adventure?
And for video games, it's basically the most... It's for that kind of game, it's kind of the game that codified those tropes. It's not good.
I don't know, I just feel like there's got to be something better known than Heavy Rain.
Heavy Rain is really well known. I remember there was a lot of hype about Heavy Rain when it first came out, but we're getting derailed by Heavy Rain.
The best
David
type
Cage,
of derailment, okay?
David Cage. All right, we got to do an episode about Heavy Rain now. Anyway, but the point is, even that game was still taking a different kind of formal approach, and that's something that's basically all you can do with zombies. You can try and do Night of the Living Dead in a different form, or you can try your best to make Night of the Living Dead with like original characters and hope that it's enough to overcome the fact that you know exactly what the plot's going to be.
Yeah. There's really only so many zombie movies that have been made. As we've been saying, like, I'm not bringing up new information in this instance, but there are still a couple that try and do something different, and those tend to be the ones that we don't hear as much about as well, which is unfortunate, but expected. Given the content of what they are, which I can think of two: Resident Evil, the series, which is tangentially a zombie movie, but also which makes it very different from everything. That's a tricky one in general to even talk about as a zombie movie, because it's like 1/8 zombie movie. They become more of a background threat, a looming. They are a ticking time bomb for the series. There's always that threat of zombies, and so they're just always in the background. They're always a time limit to get somewhere and do something, to get out of this place, to move to the next place, whatever. They're kind of a time bomb, a wave that can't be stopped, that needs... You get what I'm saying.
Yeah, and those movies are interesting just because of how much they change in between. Like, say what you will about the quality of the franchise, they're a guilty pleasure of mine for sure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But say what you will about like the quality of the writing or the directing or the action or whatever, but you can't accuse it of being the same movie every time, because the first one is probably the closest thing to like a traditional zombie movie, but it's more like Aliens in a lot of ways. Like, there's this underground compound, and like there's a lot of weird sci-fi stuff, and really it's Mila Jovovich's character Alice, like, that's sort of what differentiates those movies, because she's such a weird, like, Mary Sue, like, power fantasy character, and I love it. She, like, gets a bunch of clones, and they all get, like, blown up, and then one of them, she has, like, superpowers and, like, suplexes a zombie, and in the next she doesn't.
It's absurd and delightful. They're worth watching.
I think so. So yeah, and just the tone of each movie is sort of set by that character, and they're just super bizarre because you expect them. They only do. I remember this observation was made in like an old like episode of Red Letter Media's Half in the Bag, like from ages ago, when like the 5th one came out, whatever one, Retribution, I think. They were talking about, because I remember, I saw this movie in theaters, because of course I did. But they were talking about how the intro of that movie, since the premise of that one is that they create like these artificial environments to put zombies in as like a test. Yeah, so like you do. So, but with the premise of that one, that was like the first time, the intro of that movie, where they indulged in kind of the classic Romero scenario of like the family in the house, like everyone like boarded up, but the sequence is only 10 minutes long. It's the character involved is not Alice, is not Mila Jovovich, it's a Mila Jovovich clone, and then she gets killed, and then the plot just goes wherever it wants.
I have seen that one, and there's like one of them eventually escapes, and there's a bunch of her dead at the bottom of a well or something.
Even that one's kind of an Aliens ripoff too, because doesn't she like find a kid and like adopt the kid? It's like a clone, whatever.
Probably. Let's be honest.
Resident Evil's great and stupid. And then the games are kind of another matter entirely too, because they're similar in that zombies. The first Resident Evil is maybe, or like kind of that old style is maybe the most of like a zombie game, where kind of the creeping death is like the focus. But even they're more like sci-fi, like you fight a big snake at one point and you're going through like this lab. And that's kind of what makes that franchise more fun and interesting, I think, than your average Romero knockoff that tries to do zombies really, really dramatic, play it really straight, and just when you're trying to keep it pared down, all you can do is just recycle the Romero tropes because Romero got it right the first time.
See, but that kind of gets into the idea of what is a zombie movie at that point? What makes it a Walking Dead, not just another action movie that has zombies in it? And, I mean, zombie purists will be like, well, they have to, only shamble. Running zombies aren't a thing. They can't clearly can't run. Look at their legs. They have to be afraid of fire, but not like light. They transfer by bite, and they can only be shot in the head. If you get shot in the heart, it doesn't count. So,
you know those rules really well. I don't think I would have been able to rattle all those off.
A lot of zombie movies, all right? So, it's kind of, it starts to draw the line on what a zombie movie is, which is going to lead into my final kind of piece of media that I would like to discuss in relation to The Walking Dead, which is Warm Bodies.
I was going to bring up Warm Bodies too, although I have never seen it.
I have. It's a weird movie. This is one that I don't think most people will even remember. It's about a girl who falls in love with a zombie. Essentially, actually, you know what it is? It's Bob's Burgers fan fiction. It's what Tina writes. So
Bob's
if you've
Burgers
seen that,
fan fiction?
yes, 100%.
That's your description. Oh my god! All right. Oh man, that's the best description of it I've ever heard.
Half the people out there know exactly what I'm talking about. Because that's all Tina writes about is zombie love fiction. And that's what this movie is. And it is such a bizarre take on the zombie genre and the way it's a weird spin on death. It's a weird spin on love. It's the weirdest fucking movie I've seen. And I haven't seen it in a long ass time, but now I kind of want to go back and watch it again because hoo boy, it was a wild ride. And it turns what you it's a whole love story from the perspective of a zombie. So it's automatically a more interesting and original idea than half the stuff that gets pumped out. It's not good, mind you, but it's interesting. Because we see all the tropes of a Romero movie from a totally different perspective. From the perspective of the zombie, from watching these people flee and die and whatnot while he falls in love with a... Look, I don't understand it either. It was weird, but it's still an interesting piece to look at as far as zombie media goes.
Yeah, Warm Bodies. I think it's also worth mentioning, I can't talk about the content of the movie just because I haven't seen it. But I can talk about, because I do remember, like, the time that movie came out and sort of the climate. It came out on both the tail end of the Twilight thing, I believe. Like when Twilight was a big craze.
It was probably closer to the middle, but yeah.
Yeah, but during that, it was contemporary to the Twilight movies, and also, definitely in the middle of, like, when zombies were at their biggest. Like, they've died down a little bit.
This is the only time that movie could have ever come out.
No, totally. And I think it's worth mentioning just because that movie is also working with taking from a different set of tropes, and that it's also, like, I've heard, like, a synopsis of the plot. It's also a spin on Romeo and Juliet, and so there's that. But also, I don't know what else to say about that. I haven't seen it.
So there's that.
About the Shakespearean importance of Warm Bodies, on the Warm Bodies cast, I guess. But also, the fact that it was specifically kind of parodying the whole, like, YA supernatural romance thing that was really big at the time. And I don't know if that was based on actually a book or not. I wouldn't be surprised if it was. I also wouldn't be surprised if it was just kind of a movie someone made, but it definitely was also in dialogue with kind of the whole Twilight thing that was going on. Because that's kind of the joke, right? Is that like Edward Cullen is like undead, but he's a sexy kind of undead. Whereas, haha, isn't it funny that like this girl wants to bang a zombie because he's like rotting? But
oh
it's
my
like
god,
Twilight
that movie
still.
came out in 2013. I swear to God, that came out in like 2008.
Oh no, I remember it being. I thought it was. That's a little later than I was expecting, but not that much later. I was thinking like 2010, 2011. Yeah, so that movie also maybe, again, not having seen it, maybe gets to be more interesting, like just because it's not just cribbing totally from Romero. It's kind of like trying to steal a little bit of Shakespeare here, steal a little bit of like current YA trends there, and mixes it all up into apparently like this wild cocktail that now I kind of want to watch.
It's insane. It was a weird movie. I mean, that's all I have really to add to the trends of media.
Yeah, I think this would be a good time to start talking about Night of the Living Dead itself, a movie that we have not much mentioned in specifics until this point.
No, but I mean, it's such a core piece to our pop culture nowadays, especially the death that it creates is specifically. So, with that being said, though, let's dive into spoilers and let's talk about Night of the Living Dead. We did kind of go over our general thoughts on it as to whether we liked it or not. So let's dive into how death is handled. The first guy who dies is the brother about 5 minutes in. And I know that you thought this was really interesting, and I agree with you upon review.
Yeah, so Johnny, I think one of the most interesting things about this movie's beginning is how it plays with who the point of view character is supposed to be. Because, you know, when you start a movie, not always, but you typically go in with the expectation that, like, the character that the camera is kind of following for the first part is your protagonist.
It also helped that it's a generic white dude.
Yeah. And he is generic, but he's also given kind of a pretty well-defined personality in that point. He's kind of snarky, kind of like a whiner. He's making all these like glib comments about his family, and I also think it's super interesting that Johnny is the one to bring up, because they're visiting a graveyard and putting a wreath on their father's grave, I believe.
Yes.
And he's sort of questioning, like, why do we have these death rituals? And why do we even bother doing this? You know, he's dead. He's just a sack of meat in the ground. And that's something that comes up, like, quite a bit in this movie. I think more so than any other particular... Because, you know, zombies have had so many different kinds of social perspectives, so many different interpretations between movies, within movies, about what they're supposed to represent, kind of this mob. But there's a real... And I think the movie is definitely playing with some of those expectations about what the zombies like represent, but also there's a real focus on them just as bodies, just as like they're dead people. They're walking around, but they're still dead, and they have all of the, and that's sort of the fear that I think is really being pointed at more than anything else. This idea that once you're dead, you don't matter, and that you're just, you know, they're part of a horde. No individual zombie is that important.
Plus,
and
they work on a level of just looming death. They are a physical embodiment of our own mortality. They are the dead brought back simply to kill. They have no ultimate goal other than to make you not alive. They are to bring you down with them. They are a representation of our own mortality, and some of his glib comments does a nice job of illuminating that.
Yeah, and not only to kill you, but to eat you, to like really get at that other kind of raw, like when we think of raw primal human instincts or like essential components that like you can't get away from as a human being. Like it's usually we think of it as like sex being like a sexual desire being like one of those primal drives, and then like hunger being something that's just like deep down like kind of this animalistic thing. And I think that also is something the movie is concerned with, maybe not as explicitly, but just sort of knocking humanity down a peg and like emphasizing their status as a kind of mindless, like hungry animal. Because a scene that stood out as interesting and weird to me after Barbara kind of gets away and goes into the house where kind of the rest of the action of the film is going to be, she gets scared by going to the room with all the dead like animal heads, like the mounted like deer on the wall. It's presented as being kind of like this really frightening moment, and it's kind of strange, and at first you think maybe it's just sort of like this jump scare, but I think that connection is being made, especially with Barbara, who spends the rest of the movie basically like emotionally comatose. Just sort of this idea that the trappings of humanity are very thin. They're very there is not as much separating us from an animal or a zombie as we think there is. And I think that focus on kind of the body, the flesh, is something that keeps coming up again and again in the film, because then there's the choice to have the scientist who's explaining. There's a lot of exposition delivered through the television in this movie, which I also think is kind of an interesting choice, because the zombies are treated more as not like a total societal breakdown. That's maybe one of the things that's a little bit different about this movie, is that it's treated more like a natural disaster almost.
It is also stressed at one point that it's in like the lower eastern seaboard only. Yeah,
so it's regional, and they, by the end of the movie, like, they get it under control basically, and or at least, like, that's kind of the visual implication. It's not like The Walking, that is one thing maybe the other zombie movies like The Walking Dead do differently, in that it is focused on like the long-term like breakdown of society, whereas this one, it's more of a individualized disaster. But regardless, we get that information presented to us with the TV screen, and at one point the scientist or the journalist or whoever it is in this particular moment, it goes through a couple different people, is really emphasizing like, nope, you have to burn them. You have to burn them or they'll rise again. He specifically calls out our death rituals in a really like glib, really
callous.
Yeah, callous sort of way. And like don't do your silly death rituals. Like, you just got to burn them. Like, they're gone. Forget about them. And I think that was an element of the movie that, again, is maybe not something unique to it's certainly not unique to this movie in the grand scheme of zombie movies, because nothing is unique to this movie, because it's been pillaged and plundered by every zombie movie since.
It was unique to this movie.
I think it stands out still as a strong thematic connection, and helps get at, I think, what makes it so effective, what made it such a template for a prime target for theft.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to take a minute and double back to your reference to the trophy room with all the deer heads. And as you were talking about it, it really brought me to the realization, too, that as she was looking at it, she saw herself within them as more than your analogy, but also as a hunter-hunted thing. She saw herself as a deer. She goes into shock like a deer in headlights for the rest of the movie after watching the unstoppable hunters that we are to deer come at her. So this room was such a mess of metaphor and realization just through these dead animals that are common, or were commonplace for the time. It was a perfect metaphor for so much that works also as just kind of a jump scare. It shows up, and if you don't really dive into it, it's really easy to just write off.
Yeah, it's not an element that really calls attention to itself, but has a lot of meat on its bones, a lot of weight to kind of the rest of the concerns of the movie, which I think Again, speaks to kind of the strong directorial vision that Romero had, in just kind of including what otherwise might have just been like a throwaway shot, just another throwaway jump scare in a movie. And I think he does a great job surrounding it with this context that makes you consider the movie in different ways.
Yeah, everything I have, as I said, I bash on this movie starting out, but there is so much to gain from it. Like, every shot feels important to something, a reference, a metaphor, even just advancing the plot. There's no shot that's wasted.
And I think that's an element that's not super obvious. The intent behind everything is something that's not super obvious just on like a first watch, especially just because of how strange that beginning is, how there's a lot of focus for maybe the first half hour of the movie after the scene where Barbara escapes. There's not a lot of dialogue. We're treated to just kind of this visual stillness of Ben arriving and, boarding up the house and kind of taking charge of the situation, and Barbara just sort of taking everything in and like shock. A lot of shots of her to create like tension. A lot of shots of her to establish like character, all done without a lot of dialogue. And I think that though that transitionary moment between the beginning in the graveyard and kind of the bulk of the movie, where it's kind of just Ben and Barbara in the house, I think that is interesting because it starts to play with your expectations of who you think the protagonist is going to be, because it follows Barbara for so long that you expect it to be her, that, eventually she'll like snap out of it and, help out Ben. But really, like, Ben's our hero. Barbara can't do much of anything. Like, she ends up sitting to the side most of the time. So we end up kind of switching our focus over to him, where the zombies take on a whole new connotation.
Yeah, this was something that I noticed pretty quickly when I saw the first one, and I didn't actually know who the main character of this movie was. So, Ben is African American, and that's important because as you watch the movie, all of the zombies are completely white. They are devoid of color from, they're dead, so they're drained of color. However, even still, you can tell that they're very much white. And as kind of an additional little interesting tidbit, while Barbara is the main focus, all of the zombies are guys. There's no female zombies shown until it starts to shift focus. So there's a lot of social commentary to unpack just from those two sentences. It's a clear representation of the male oppressment of females and the looming threat that they have to deal with. It's a clear representation of the white man oppression of the African American culture and the fear that they have to deal with, especially because in the end, and I'm jumping right to the end for a minute, Ben is killed by a white dude. Not a zombie, but he's shot in the head by a white guy who thinks he's a zombie. It's
a white police officer, I must specify.
Which is relevant very much today.
Unfortunately. But yes, you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty much all I had to say, honestly. But it goes back to that whole punk rock ahead of its time. I'm kind of coming around on this movie the more I talk about it. I don't think it's visually that entertaining, but I think what it says and what it did and what it promoted were so revolutionary for a movie that came out in 1968.
It's still super interesting when you really dig into it, right?
It's
like on
still
the surface,
100% relevant too. That's the part that is upsetting, is how relevant it still is. It's crazy.
Yeah, so there are a couple things regarding both of those points, because the ending is very interesting and also very messy for a lot of reasons, I feel like. But I kind of want to hold off on that just because there's a smaller point to be made regarding the section where all the zombies are kind of male from Barbara's POV, and that's how the way Romero handles the kind of reveal of the rules, the now classic rules that are all like codified in this movie that you had mentioned earlier, is that the way we slowly get the reveal of that information is very well done, because the zombies get less and less human looking as they go on. And I think that's another thing about Barbara's section, is that the threat, it recalls to mind that kind of fear of like assault by a man so much, because the first zombie we see, like, you know, his face isn't rotting yet, like he's not all gory and messed up, like he looks fairly normal
the whole
on a
scene
first glance.
where he grabs her in first glance could be confused from an outside perspective as assault, and the brother takes it to be assault. It doesn't look like a zombie attack. Like, I mean, obviously they would have no reason to suspect a zombie attack, but I mean, first blush to anyone would be, it's a dude assaulting a woman.
Yeah, and that continues for a bit. Like, the zombies, it keeps going on, and then there's a few more, and we don't really, like, if you take, I suppose, the title, reveals what they are immediately too, but just kind of looking at the film as its own thing, we don't really get our indication that these are anything but like really deranged people until Ben shoots one and it keeps moving, and it's kind of really underplayed, but it's a really important moment. It doesn't go down immediately when he shoots it, and yeah, so I just think, and then there's kind of the, you know, the reveal of like the fire. They're scared of fire again, kind of another primal like animal instinct that isn't necessarily something humans don't have. So, and then as the movie goes on, they gain more, or perhaps they lose more and more of those traits of what makes it a human fear, of like that fear of like a sexual assault, like that kind of thing, and more and into more of that primal fear. They just get, the rules are established, we can see the decay on them, and it just sort of shifts.
They honestly become, and to Ben's character and his level in his own oppression subplot, it becomes a faceless white mass. There is a face to an assault. There is a face to that type of oppression. I mean, obviously women are dealing with a different but the same style of faceless male oppression that Ben would be feeling from the faceless white oppression. But with Barbara, she tends to see, it's very personal. It tends to be 1-on-1, 2-on-1, 3-on-1. But when Ben shows up, that's when we start to get more of that horde, where it becomes a society oppressing.
And I think this is a good place to mention that from both of these characters' points of view, the other one represents that same fear. So, and I think I especially noticed this, and again, like, it is a movie from the 60s, so it's not, I adore its punk rock sensibilities, but it's still definitely a messy movie. So, for example, there is this sense that whether intentionally or not, that the movie is playing with kind of those old racist tropes and fears of like the black man alone with the white woman, and that would be something that would be and we're seeing that right after this scene where like this first zombie attack is framed as like a assault by like a male. So it's playing into that, but and especially because like I said, the movie is deserves a lot of credit, but it's still perhaps a bit messy. Like I'm definitely sure Ben punches her at one point.
Yeah, 100%.
So that's not great. That's not great at all, actually. But the same is also true of Ben, though, and that those shots of Barbara as very distant, not communicating, very, very much acting like the same like white horde, like, he can't really trust her either. So it's sort of like from both characters' points of view, like they could be the zombie as well. And I feel like, you know, the from this point up forward, the focus in the film shifts to Ben quite a bit. Is that continues to be true when sort of his main antagonist ends up being Cooper, the man with the daughter, the asshole, the stock asshole character, as he has become. And so what I think is super interesting about that ending is really, really, really interesting just because of how underplayed it is. Because I had heard, like I said, when I went into this movie, the ending was the only thing I knew about it, that it was famous, that it was like a famous movie ending, and so I expected it to be a bit more dramatic than it is, but it's very understated until those last shots, that really chilling credit sequence of
the credit sequence is upsetting. It's
phenomenal, but also like gut-wrenching. Where like Ben, you just see his like limp body, like he just looks like one of the zombies now, just being piled on with the rest of them, just another hunk of meat for the flame. Yeah, so it's super, so like that gets a little more focused, but like his death itself, just he's in the shadows, he's like, and he doesn't trust the police coming to get him. He's got his gun at the ready because he's already been betrayed. He's already been shown that like he can't trust the people in the people in the house. So, you know, why should he trust the people, the white men with guns coming after him? And he just all off, like basically off screen, like just not off screen, but just in a quick moment, just bam, like he's gone.
Gets shot in the head. The guy who shoots him is congratulated, and the movie ends. It's so fast. It's something else.
So I think what's super interesting and kind of messy about that ending is that even though our sympathies are very clearly with Ben, he's the sensible hero, he's trying to think in smart, dynamic ways, like the Cooper just wants to like lock everyone in the basement and just like wait it out, and we're on board with Ben the entire time, and like when things go wrong, they don't necessarily go wrong because of him. It's either just like bad luck or like him not being able to rely on his allies. But the crazy thing is that Cooper ends up being right in the end. Ben survives because he does what Cooper wanted him to do in the first place.
Yeah. It's there, as I said, there's nothing about this movie that isn't a lot to take in. It's just not immediately evident. And it really takes a good conversation like this to underscore how much brilliance is in this movie. I think that visually and narratively, the overarching narrative, it doesn't hold up to today's standards because we see it so much and so often. But I think the subplot, and I think what he does with the camera work, and I think the visual storytelling is exemplary and should be looked at for years to come because it does so much so far ahead of its time. It's brilliant is what it is. It's absolutely brilliant, and that is why this movie is a masterpiece.
Yeah, and I think as far as not holding up just because it's been ripped off so much, I mean, I agree and I disagree, and I think that there's still that messiness that, like, I kind of, in like, not just the punk rock sensibility, but we don't see. So I think in a modern movie, that ending would have been a lot more neat and tidy, where the morality of, like, we want our hero to succeed and keeping in line with that, addressing the social issues, it would be a lot more Ben is proven right in the end. He escapes. The old man gets everyone killed, perhaps because with his stuck in his ways, like trying to stay in the basement. But it's also super interesting because it works, but it doesn't work because he gets shot anyway.
Yeah,
like that's the kind of thing is that I feel like with this movie, it's so, despite the fact that the plot has been done to death now, it has that richness that like leaves you thinking about it, leaves you questioning it a little bit more. Like the power dynamics at play, it really leaves you thinking about what exactly is being said. I think it's still just such a rich, well put together film that it stands above. Like I would certainly recommend someone watch this over like The Walking Dead.
I think really I need to take another viewing on this one. I will say that I wasn't the freshest going into this. I had just come off a long day of working on things. So I think maybe going back into this with a little bit of a fresher mindset would be good for me, because even just talking about it, I'm loving it more and more. And I think it would be really interesting to see, again, now that I have a better mindset, now that I have a better understanding of the movie.
Yeah, it always helps to have that second watch. And I'm a little bit thankful that not that I had watched it to completion before. I'm thankful that I had that experience of trying to watch the intro as a teenager and not really like getting into it, just because I was still like when you'd propose like, oh, we should do Night of the Living Dead and honor Romero, I was totally on board. But like part of me was wondering like, oh, maybe we should have done Dawn of the Dead, like maybe this one won't hold up. Like I remember like it was kind of hard to get, I never got through it when I was younger, but like I'm really glad that we did this one, just because having that experience where it seemed like just another old movie that's like out of date, and seeing kind of all this bold like social commentary that's not at all like played with like a sledgehammer. It all feels really fresh, and yet at the same time really messy and interesting. And yeah, I guess George Romero is the fucking man. Like, like God rest his soul, he was brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he deserves all the respect that has been given to him and more. That's all it boils down to. You should go watch his movies. You should watch this one. You should watch all of them. Go do that now.
I'm certainly going to go watch more of them, that's for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. I really want to go see Dawn of the Dead now, too. But that's for another time. This has been Beating a Dead Horse. Once again, I'm Sean McKinda.
And I'm Jackson Keller.
You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. You can also find me on Twitch every Wednesday. I stream at twitch.tv/helpless_Skippy.
And you can find me over on Twitter at Jackson J. Keller, where I will maybe be posting about my George Romero marathon. Find out.
We'd also like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternative Take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. It's a good album. Go listen to it. Go support them. They're worth it. Also, please go find us on iTunes. Rate, subscribe. It helps us out a lot. We're really trying to get our name out there right now. Any little bit helps. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at BADH_cast. Every little bit helps. And, as always, remember,
they're coming for you, Barbara. Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go